The North Atlantic in 1940 was not yet a graveyard. It was a hunting ground. Germany's U-boats moved beneath the waves like wolves in an endless forest. The sea hid them, praised them, and, in time, would punish them. Captain Johann Meier had been 29 when he took command of U-134, a brand new Type 7 boat gleaming under the floodlights at Kiel. He was a product of the Navy's old school discipline, polite, carrying a pocket notebook for weather, bearings, and conscience. He believed the ocean was pure, untouched by politics. It would take him 4 years to learn that nothing is untouched. The commissioning ceremony felt like a coronation. Brass bands played, flags snapped in the wind, and officers saluted as champagne dripped down the hull. His mother wept quietly in the crowd, proud and frightened. When Meier raised his hand for the oath, he felt no conflict. For Führer and fatherland rolled easily off the tongue. The words sounded like duty, not ideology, below decks. The air already carried the mixture of diesel, oil, and metal that would become his world. The U-boat was both machine and monastery-tight corridors, murmured commands, and the constant vibration of the engines. To command one was to live inside precision. Every gauge, every turn of a valve mattered more than emotion. The first patrols were triumphs. British convoys were slow, unprotected, naive. The sea was theirs. Each report sent back to Berlin brought congratulations. Each sinking meant promotions, medals, and radio speeches celebrating the invisible heroes of the Reich. Meier's crew believed it. So did he. His war diary from September 1940 reads like poetry of control. The sea is calm, the men steady, the engines flawless. One enemy freighter destroyed by perfect calculation. The sound of the torpedo's impact was clean, like a clock striking the hour. War, when conducted by professionals, seems almost moral. Between missions, they docked at Lorient or St. Nazaire bases, carved into the French coast like concrete cathedrals. There were dancers, photographs, and the illusion of normal life. Letters from home praised them as knights of the deep. They began to believe their own legend. Yet even in those first months, something unsettled Meier. After every patrol he dreamt of the surface, the sound of wind through the periscope, the color of sky that he hadn't truly seen in weeks. He felt pride, but also something unnamed that followed him into sleep. The awareness that victory at sea left no witnesses by winter. The Atlantic turned cruel. Storms smashed across the conning tower, and the horizon blurred between water and sky. The U-boat became a sealed world, its men moving by instinct, their skin always damp, their humor growing brittle. Meier learned to recognize the look that came after long hours submerged, eyes rimmed red, pupils wide, souls slightly adrift. He kept order through ritual. Each morning, inspection of engines and torpedoes. Each evening, a few lines read aloud from the log. He believed structure would keep the men human. What he did not know was that structure also kept doubt away. On their third patrol, they intercepted a convoy east of Iceland. The attack was methodical calculations, bearings, timing. The first explosion confirmed his skill. The second confirmed something else, that his mind could separate the act from its consequence. As the sub descended again into silence, one seaman whispered a prayer. Meier pretended not to hear. Prayer implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. When they surfaced hours later, the sea was littered with debris planks, barrels, an overturned lifeboat. The lookouts reported voices calling in the dark. The regulations were clear. Rescue risked discovery. He logged the coordinates, turned the boat away, and continued east. In the official report, the phrase was clinical. No survivors cited. That night, Meier opened his notebook and wrote a single line. The sea keeps secrets better than men do. The months that followed hardened him. Every patrol meant longer submergence, colder water, and fewer returns. The ocean had begun to change sides. The Allies grew stronger. Sonar and depth charges became the new language of the deep. The hunter's thrill was replaced by endurance. Still, Berlin celebrated them. Medals arrived. Radio broadcasts called the U-boat arm Germany's shield beneath the waves. The men saluted, drank, laughed, and then went below again. The laughter never reached their eyes. Meier's correspondence with his fiancée grew sparse. He had learned to speak only in statistics. 2 ships sunk, good weather, morale steady. She replied with photographs of gardens and blue skies. He could not look at them for long. They belonged to another species of life. In November 1940, a storm forced the boat to remain submerged for 36 hours. The oxygen thinned, the temperature rose, condensation dripped from the bulkheads like sweat. In the half-light of emergency lamps, Meier saw his crew not as soldiers, but as men trapped inside a metal lung. He realized then that command was not glory, it was custody when they finally surfaced. The men staggered onto the deck, gasping. The horizon was empty, endless. Meier lifted his binoculars, scanning for anything that proved the world still existed. Only grey water met his gaze. The ocean stretched in every direction, indifferent, immense, and entirely silent. He wrote that night, "Perhaps we mistake obedience for courage. The sea does not care who commands it. It only asks what we are willing to become in its darkness." That was the beginning of the fracture, though he would not admit it for another year. Beneath the triumphs and decorations, the first crack had appeared, the faint realization that duty without conscience is another form of drowning. The year 1941 began like a hymn. The newspapers in Berlin called it the year of victory at sea. U-boats were legends. Their captains had the aura of knights, reborn, solitary, disciplined, invisible. At the Naval Academy, cadets whispered Meier's name the way children whisper the names of saints. His patrols were studied. His calm under pressure had become myth. Yet inside the myth, the man was slowly vanishing. When U-134 left Lorient in January, the pier was lined with soldiers and nurses waving flags. A band played Ich hat ihn Kameraden. The crew smiled, young and proud, their uniforms crisp, their boots shining. The moment the submarine slipped beneath the surface, color disappeared. Only grey remained. The men exhaled the last air of the world above and inhaled the weight of the deep down there. Sound became the enemy. Every creak of metal, every drop of condensation echoed like a confession. The ocean pressed against the hull with the patience of eternity. Meier learned to sense depth not by instrument but by instinct. The subtle shift in tone when the sea stopped forgiving, he still believed in purpose. Each ship we sink, he told the crew, shortens the war. Every convoy we break saves lives on the fatherland's soil. The men nodded, grateful for a reason to believe. But in the captain's own mind, faith had begun to sound rehearsed. His log for February 9th reads, 3 freighters sunk. Weather rough. Morale good. I remind the men we are defending civilization. I write the word but cannot define it. One night, while trailing a British convoy south of Greenland, they waited motionless at 80 meters, engines off, listening through hydrophones. The rhythmic pulse of propellers filled the boat. Meier closed his eyes. It felt like listening to a heartbeat. Then came the order, mechanical and quiet. The torpedo ran true. The men cheered softly as the periscope showed the explosion bloom across the dark surface. It was a sight they had seen a dozen times. Yet something about it unsettled him, the flame reflecting on the waves like a dying sun. When the second ship was struck, he turned away. It was victory, but it did not feel like triumph. Later, in his cabin, he wrote, "There is a line between efficiency and cruelty. It is invisible until crossed, and by then the sea has already erased our footprints." By spring, U-boat losses were still low. Admiral Dunitz praised them in daily communiques. Radio Berlin broadcast triumphs in orchestral tones. "Each sinking is a blow for peace," the announcer said. Meier listened without expression. To him, peace had become a word that lived only on land. At sea, the men grew superstitious. One officer carried a photograph of his fiancée in his breast pocket. Another never shaved on patrol. They celebrated birthdays with chocolate rations and songs that sounded forced. Laughter in the confined air was short and brittle, dying quickly against steel walls. Sometimes, when the submarine surfaced at night to recharge batteries, Meier stood alone on the conning tower, the freezing wind cutting across his face. The ocean glowed faintly under starlight. He felt both infinite and trapped, a god in a cage. He wrote later, "We live between pressure and emptiness. The surface blinds, the depths deafen. Somewhere between them, conscience whispers." In May, they encountered a merchant ship that tried to flee rather than surrender. Regulations required sinking without warning if the ship transmitted signals. Meier gave the order, as he always had. But when the sound of impact came, there was a tremor in his voice. He realized it too late. The men noticed. That night, no one spoke at dinner. The next morning, a young engineer approached him privately. "Captain, sir, will this war ever end?" Meier looked at him. "Of course. Every war ends." The boy nodded, hesitated, and whispered, "But will we?" For the first time, the captain had no answer. By autumn 1941, the ocean had turned against them. British radar had grown sharper. Depth charges rained like thunder. The hunters became hunted. On one patrol near the Azores, U-134 was trapped for 20 hours. Each explosion above felt closer than the last. Bolts shook loose, lights flickered. Men clutched crucifixes, pencils, anything solid enough to promise survival. When the attacks finally ceased, the silence was unbearable. The crew sat in the half-dark, their faces grey, sweat mixed with diesel fumes. Meier ordered the phonograph to play something, a record of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. The music filled the boat, thin but haunting. One officer began to cry quietly. No one spoke of it after surfacing. Meier noted in his journal, "The enemy above has better weapons, but our true adversary is within. Fear corrodes faster than salt water." When they returned to base, the Admiralty awarded him another Iron Cross. Photographers captured him, smiling for the papers. The photo shows a confident young officer, jaw firm, eyes steady. But if one looks closely, the expression behind them is not pride. It is exhaustion disguised as poised. He sent the medal home to his mother with a brief note. For your collection, she would never know that her son had begun to dream not of victory, but of silence. The year closed with celebration on land and weariness at sea. Meier attended a naval banquet in Paris, where generals toasted to the invincibility of German steel. He raised his glass, but drank nothing. He knew the truth: steel could not admit that every alloy, no matter how strong, bends when the temperature rises enough. As he returned to his quarters that night, he overheard two officers laughing about the war's progress. "England will be starved within a year," one said. "We'll dine in London next Christmas." Meier walked past them silently. Outside, the Seine reflected the city lights like oil on water. He realized he felt no hatred for the enemy, only a strange, growing pity, a feeling his uniform could not justify. His final diary entry of 1941 read, "We call ourselves wolves, but perhaps we are blind fish, moving by instinct, mistaking darkness for safety. The sea teaches obedience, but never forgiveness." He closed the book, unaware that the next year would bring the event that would define him forever. The day when obedience and conscience would collide, and only one would surface. The Atlantic had grown colder by 1942. Allied ships now traveled in great convoys, escorted by destroyers whose sonar pulses beat through the water like heart monitors. For every merchantman sunk, a submarine was lost. Yet Berlin still demanded numbers, still spoke of tonnage war as if lives could be measured in arithmetic. Captain Johann Meier was now 31. He had become what the Navy admired: efficient, disciplined, quietly ruthless. Each patrol began with handshakes and ended with silence. The logbooks recorded tonnage. The faces of the drowned remained unrecorded. That changed on September 12, 1942, at dawn. U-2 134 sighted smoke on the horizon. Through the periscope, Meier saw a large liner escorted by a corvette. Orders were clear: any ship aiding the Allies was a target. He gave the command, and the torpedo ran straight. The explosion came a minute later, deep, resonant concussion that trembled through the hull. The men waited for the second detonation, the signal of success. It came followed by something unexpected: faint cries over the hydrophones. Human voices, hundreds of them, carried by the sea. "Captain," the radio operator said, removing his headphones, "there are survivors, many." Meier felt the weight settle in his chest. He surfaced cautiously. The periscope view filled with debris, lifeboats, wreckage, and figures in the water waving frantically. It was the first time he had truly seen them. He ordered the engines stopped. The bridge fell silent except for the slap of waves against the hull. The men watched uneasy. "Shall we dive, sir?" someone asked. He didn't answer. A voice called out in English, hoarse but clear, "Help us." For a long moment, Meier said nothing. Then, almost to himself, "We can't leave them." The officers exchanged glances. Everyone knew the regulations. Rescuing survivors was forbidden, it risked discovery and contradicted propaganda that said the enemy were monsters. But conscience had surfaced with the wreckage. Within an hour, lifeboats were lashed alongside the U-boat. Men and women were pulled aboard, shivering, oil-streaked, terrified. Among them were British sailors, Polish laborers, and Italian prisoners of war. Meier realized with a shock that he had killed men who had been fighting on Germany's side. He cleared the deck of weapons, turned his officers into medics, ordered blankets and bread distributed. The crew obeyed, some in disbelief, some with quiet relief. "We are sailors before we are soldiers," he said. A message was sent in plain language over open radio frequencies, offering coordinates for rescue. It was the first time Meier had ever spoken to the world without encryption. The message read, "German submarine assisting survivors of torpedoed ship. Request help. Will not attack." The risk was enormous. To reveal position was to invite death. But he could not do otherwise. 2 days later, aircraft appeared on the horizon American markings. Meier ordered red crosses painted on sheets and laid across the deck. Survivors waved. The submarine's bridge crew looked up, expecting recognition. The planes circled once, then opened fire. Bullets tore across the sea. Shrapnel clanged against the conning tower. Meier ordered everyone below. Survivors screamed. The engines roared to full speed, diving away from the carnage above. Inside the boat, the crew sat in stunned silence, listening to explosions fade. Hours later, when they surfaced again, the ocean was empty. The lifeboats were gone. Meier stood on the deck until night fell. No one spoke to him. At last he went below, sat at his desk, and opened the logbook. Instead of the usual coordinates and tonnage, he wrote only one line. "We obeyed humanity and were punished by it." In Berlin, the incident was met with silence. The High Command censured him privately. "You endangered valuable equipment and morale," the message read. Compassion is not a naval procedure. Official reports omitted any mention of rescue efforts. The Laconia was simply recorded as another victory. Meier never again saw the ocean the same way. Each depth reading, each bearing, each order carried an echo of that day. He had seen what was beneath the statistics, faces, not targets. His journal that winter contained almost no military notes, only reflections. We tell ourselves that orders absolve us. But the ocean remembers everything. Every wreck, every cry, remains somewhere in the water, waiting for the current to return it to us. By the time U-134 returned to base, the crew had changed. They drank quietly, avoided the boasting of other officers. When the Admiral asked Meier for a report, he handed over the log without comment. "You'll recover your discipline, Captain," the Admiral said coldly. Meier saluted, but the gesture was hollow. Discipline had lost its meaning. That night, he walked along the dock under blackout lights, the smell of diesel and salt thick in the air. The water lapped against the concrete, indifferent as always. He realized that obedience had once been his armor. Now it was his wound. The Laconia had sunk, but something else had gone down with his faith in the idea that morality could be delegated. The ocean had given him back his conscience, but at a price he would never repay. Winter 1942 arrived with new orders and an old silence. U-134 sat moored in the submarine pens of Lorient, its steel hulls scarred by patrols and salt. The crew went through motions, maintenance, inspections, briefings, but the spirit had drained out of them. The laughter that once echoed in the narrow corridors had become whispers. To outsiders, they were heroes. To themselves, they were ghosts with medals. Captain Johann Meier walked the docks like a man studying a language. He no longer believed in. Propaganda posters along the walls showed smiling sailors and triumphant slogans. Unsere U-Boot-Schlagen, über. He stared at them and thought, perhaps the posters are the only victories left. After the Laconia patrol, headquarters treated him politely, but with distance. His report had been filed, then sealed. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. Unofficially, everyone knew. He was no longer invited to certain briefings. Some officers avoided him in corridors. Others offered awkward salutes, as if contact might be contagious. At night, in his small quarters above the docks, Meier wrote long letters he never sent. The sea remains honest. It gives back what we put into it. Fear for fear, mercy for mercy. The land has forgotten this balance. In early 1943, the new orders arrived. The campaign against Allied shipping would intensify. Crews were reminded that hesitation was betrayal. Every captain was to confirm his loyalty by signature. Meier signed, but slowly, as though the ink itself were heavy. The Navy introduced political officers aboard some vessels, men whose job was not navigation but ideology. They spoke of victory as destiny and of mercy as weakness. When the first such officer was assigned to U-134, Meier met him on the gangway, a young lieutenant with perfect posture and a rehearsed smile. "I will ensure morale and political clarity, Captain," the man said. Meier nodded. "On this boat, clarity comes from the compass." The lieutenant's smile thinned, but he said nothing. They set out again in March. The Atlantic greeted them with cold indifference. Inside the submarine, space and time blurred. The crew moved through routines, plotting courses, listening through hydrophones, checking gauges, the rhythm of obedience. The political officer spoke often in the mess, quoting from speeches broadcast from Berlin. "Our strength is unity," he would say. "Discipline is our salvation." The men listened politely, then returned to their instruments. Only the engines answered him with steady defiance. One night, as the officer left the control room, Meier turned to his first watch officer. "He mistakes silence for agreement," he said quietly. "It's a common error these days." Their fourth week at sea brought another convoy contact. The periscope showed faint silhouettes against the grey dawn. The standard procedure was simple: calculate, fire, vanish. But Meier hesitated. He remembered the voices from the Laconia, the fragile sound of survival fading into the waves. He gave the order at last, but something inside him recoiled. When the distant plume rose and the sonar confirmed another ship gone still, he felt no victory, only the echo of his own command returning like a question. The political officer congratulated him. "Perfect shot, Captain." "Germany thanks you," Meier replied. "The sea keeps its own records." In the weeks that followed, tension thickened. Allied air patrols forced longer dives. The air inside grew stale. The men slept in shifts, dreams interrupted by the pulse of sonar. Once, when depth charges rolled above them for hours, Meier heard someone whisper a prayer. He recognized the voice, the same engineer who had asked months before, "Will we ever end?" When the silence finally returned, Meier walked the length of the boat, checking every face. He saw exhaustion, loyalty, and something close to resignation. These men no longer fought for victory. They fought because there was nowhere else to go. During a brief stop at sea to repair engines, they surfaced under stars so sharp they looked etched into glass. The political officer stood beside Meier on the bridge. "Do you ever think about the future, Captain?" he asked. "Yes," Meier said. "That's why I can't sleep." The officer smiled thinly. "The future belongs to those who believe." "And the sea," Meier said, "belongs to those who doubt." It was the closest thing to open defiance he had ever spoken aloud. The officer's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Below them, The waves whispered against the hull, carrying secrets neither of them could name. By the time they returned to port, U-boat losses across the fleet had doubled. What Berlin called strategic adjustment, sailors called disappearance. The docks once crowded with cheering crews were now lined with empty berths. Letters arrived for men who would never read them. At headquarters, Meier submitted his report in silence. The admiral glanced at it, nodded, and said, "You've served well, Captain, but headquarters is concerned about morale." It said, "You're reflective. Is that a fault, sir?" In wartime, reflection slows the trigger. Meier saluted and left without a word. That night, he walked along the submarine pens, the sound of waves echoing through the concrete arches. Somewhere in the dark, a welder's torch sparked a single point of light in the blackness. He stared at it for a long time. His diary for April 1943 contained only 3 sentences. Orders are easy. Obedience is heavy. The sea has begun to ask questions the land refuses to hear. He knew then that he would not survive this war, not because of the enemy, but because conscience and command cannot share the same vessel forever. Summer 1943 arrived muted and grey. On land, newspapers still carried headlines of confidence. At sea, everyone knew better. The U-boat war had turned. Convoys now moved under a ceiling of aircraft. Destroyers prowled the depths with patience that bordered on cruelty. Each patrol felt less like hunting and more like hiding. For Captain Johann Meier, it was the year silence began to sound louder than the ocean. U-134 had returned to duty after refit. The hull bore fresh paint, but beneath it lay fatigue metal could not hide. The same was true of the crew. They boarded with the dull discipline of habit, their faces lined by years lived under artificial light. The new orders were simple: intercept convoys off the Azores, report positions, attack only when certain. What they were not told, what rumor whispered along the docks, was that Allied codebreakers now anticipated every move. Some captains suspected betrayal. Others blamed luck. Meier blamed neither. The sea remembers who's honest, he told his men. It's just collecting its debts. By now the political officer had learned caution. He still quoted from Berlin's bulletins, but the words hung in the air unanswered. Even he seemed to sense the futility. "You've become quiet, Captain," he said one night during patrol. Meier glanced at the gauges, listening to the steady hum of the engines. "Quiet is the only thing left that's ours," he replied. The officer frowned. "You sound like a man losing faith." "I'm a man measuring it." The weeks passed in mechanical routine. They shadowed convoys, marked positions, escaped counterattacks. Depth charges were no longer terrifying. They were simply expected punctuation in the sentences of every day. The men stopped cheering after attacks. Even survival lost its thrill. Then came the order that changed everything. A coded message from headquarters arrived on a quiet morning. Engage all targets. No rescue under any circumstance. Evidence of survivors to be eliminated. Confirmation required. Meier read it twice. The words felt heavier than lead. When he looked up, the political officer was watching him. "New protocol, Captain," the man said. "Total war." Meier folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket. "Understood." His voice was calm, but inside him something began to fracture in earnest. That evening, while the boat cruised on the surface to recharge batteries, he went to the conning tower alone. The sea was flat, metallic. He thought of the Laconia, of the faces he had seen that day, and of the order he now carried. Around him the ocean whispered with the slow rhythm of inevitability. He opened his notebook and wrote, "They have found words for what conscience cannot bear. No rescue. 2 words to erase 1,000 souls." When dawn came, the first officer approached quietly. "Sir, shall we acknowledge the message?" "Not yet," Meier said. "The transmitter needs rest." The younger man nodded and said nothing more. The crew had learned that silence was sometimes the only form of loyalty left. The next convoy contact came 3 days later. Through the periscope, Meier saw merchant ships moving in perfect discipline, destroyers weaving in protective arcs. His men waited for the order. "Target," the weapons officer asked. Meier's gaze lingered. In his mind, the ships ceased to be enemies. They were simply silhouettes of people trying to go home. He lowered the periscope. "Captain." "Too far," Meier said. "We wait." They waited through the day, through the next night, until the convoy vanished beyond reach. The political officer confronted him the following morning. "You defied a direct order. I made a tactical choice. You let them escape." Meier looked at him evenly. "They were already escaping from a war none of us can win." The officer turned away, trembling with anger. "I will report this. I expect you to." For the rest of the patrol, the atmosphere grew brittle. The crew sensed it, a storm of words waiting to break. In the galley, they spoke in whispers. "The captain's not like the others," one said. "He's listening to ghosts." Another replied, "Better ghosts than Berlin." When they returned to base, Meier was summoned for debriefing. The admiral reviewed the patrol log without expression. "No tonnage sunk, Captain." "No engagement. Explain." "The conditions were unfavorable." "Conditions have been unfavorable for a year." "We don't fight weather. We fight enemies." Meier said nothing. The silence stretched until the admiral leaned forward. "Some of your officers question your zeal." "I question only the sea, sir. Careful." "Meier, the sea does not promote captains." He was dismissed with formality that felt like warning. That night, he returned to the harbor pens. Rain fell steadily, turning the concrete slick. He walked the length of his submarine, running his hand along the hull. The only thing left that still felt alive. The lights of the city shimmered across puddles like reflections of a world he no longer inhabited. He wrote one final entry for that month. "They call me hesitant. Perhaps they're right. Hesitation is humanity returning. The pause between order and action where conscience breathes." He closed the notebook and looked out over the dark water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other submarines moved like shadows, still obeying, still sinking, still vanishing. He wondered how many captains heard the same whisper he did, the sound of a question rising from the deep. By early 1944, the Atlantic no longer felt infinite. It was closing in a vast trap made of sonar and sky. The once proud submarine pens of Luojiang had grown quiet. Many berths stood empty, their crews overdue. The Navy still spoke of strategy, but everyone knew the truth. The ocean was reclaiming its debt. Captain Johann Meier returned from leave a thinner man, the kind whose eyes saw too far past conversation. The medals on his chest had dulled. The uniform fit like a memory he couldn't remove. When he stepped aboard U-134 for what he knew would be his final patrol, the dockhands barely looked up. There were no bands, no photographs, only the smell of diesel and resignation. The orders were unremarkable: patrol the mid-Atlantic, attack any Allied shipping, and transmit confirmation of success. But an additional line at the bottom caught his eye. Ensure absolute compliance. Deviation from procedure constitutes sabotage. The message was signed by an admiral he had once admired. Now it felt like a threat. Meier folded the paper, placed it in his logbook, and whispered, "So it begins." Days at sea became indistinguishable. The air inside the boat was heavy with oil, sweat, and memory. His men followed orders automatically, like musicians playing a score they no longer heard. The political officer remained now colder, almost reverent in his devotion to regulation. When a faint distress call reached them from a cargo vessel, Meier faced his choice. The coordinates placed it near their path. The signal was weak but unmistakable. His navigator looked up. "Captain, survivors requesting aid." The political officer spoke first. "Ignore it. Our duty is the offensive." Meier's reply came quietly. "Our duty is to the sea and to what's left of our souls." He ordered the course changed. The officer froze. "That's disobedience. That's command," Meier said. No one moved. The engines shifted pitch as the helmsman followed the new heading. In that moment, a line, invisible for years, finally broke. They reached the signal site hours later. The ocean was calm, deceptively gentle. Wreckage drifted in slow circles. No other vessels appeared, only the evidence of what war always left behind. Meier ordered the engine stopped. He stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon, his face unreadable. To the men below, the silence felt sacred. The political officer joined him. "You endanger us all." Meier turned. "I've endangered us every day by obeying men who mistake conscience for weakness." The officer reached for his pistol. Meier's first officer stepped forward, blocking him. "Enough," he said. "No more killing for paperwork." A long pause. Then Meier spoke softly. "Record this as my final order. We render assistance when possible. We attack no more." He descended the ladder, leaving the officer trembling in indecision. Word of his defiance spread quickly once they returned to port. Within days, Meier was summoned before the base commander. The hearing took place in a bare concrete room. A single lamp swung above the table, illuminating dust like drifting snow. "You disregarded explicit orders," the commander said. "I obeyed a higher one," Meier replied. The officer's pen scratched against paper. Higher than command, higher than fear. Outside, rain beat against the windows. No verdict was announced, but everyone in the room knew it. Meier was relieved of duty pending investigation. U-134 was assigned a new captain when he walked out into the grey afternoon. The harbour smelled of rust and surrender. Sailors avoided his gaze. He was no longer a hero, nor even a traitor, just a man stripped of usefulness. Weeks later, military police arrived at his quarters. The charge sheet read simply, "Failure to carry out orders in wartime." He was confined to a small cell near the docks. Permitted paper, but no visitors. He wrote every night by the dim light of a single bulb. The ocean forgives nothing, yet it teaches mercy. Perhaps that is why men fear it mirrors them too clearly. If conscience is mutiny, then let me be the last mutineer. Each morning guards collected his pages and filed them as evidence. They did not read them. By late 1944, the Allies were landing in France. The roar of distant artillery reached even the prison walls. The Reich was shrinking, folding in on itself. Interrogators stopped coming. There were more urgent defeats elsewhere. Meier waited without bitterness. He had already surrendered the only thing that mattered: obedience. One night, a young guard, barely 18, asked through the bars, "Why did you stop fighting, Captain?" Meier smiled faintly. "Because I finally understood what I was fighting." "And what was that?" "Myself." The boy said nothing more. He saluted quietly before leaving. In the chaos of early 1945, the base changed hands. Records burned. Prisoners were forgotten. When the gates opened, Meier simply walked out. No one recognized him. He walked to the shore, where wrecked submarines lay half submerged, their hulls tilted like monuments to futility. He touched the cold metal of one and whispered, "Rest, old friend." Then he turned inland, disappearing among refugees and fog. The hearing began in silence. No banners, no speeches, just the echo of boots in a room built for obedience. It was late 1944, and Germany itself was on trial in ways no one dared to say aloud. But the men seated behind the long wooden table believed they were still preserving order. They needed one last example of control, and Captain Johann Meier was convenient. He entered wearing a plain naval uniform stripped of insignia. His posture was erect, almost ceremonial. To the guards, he still looked like a captain. To the tribunal, he was already a verdict waiting to be written. The presiding officer read the charges. In a flat voice: failure to carry out orders, acts of moral insubordination, unauthorized contact with enemy survivors, conduct unbecoming an officer of the Reich. When he finished, the room remained still. The clerk's pen waited above the page. "Do you understand the charges?" "I do. Do you contest them?" "I acknowledge the actions." "I contest the crime." A murmur rippled among the junior officers. The presiding judge frowned. "You deny disobedience." "I deny that obedience alone defines duty." For 2 days they questioned him about patrol logs, about intercepted radio signals, about his so-called philosophical influence on his crew. They asked whether he believed in the Führer, whether he regretted his compassion, whether he understood the need for absolute loyalty. Meier answered without anger. "I believed in Germany," he said. "Then I believed in the sea. The first taught me to obey. The second taught me to think." The political officer who had once served aboard U-134 testified next. His uniform was immaculate, his voice rehearsed. "He undermined morale," he said. "He questioned orders before the men. He claimed mercy was stronger than victory." One of the judges leaned forward. "Did he incite mutiny?" "No, sir," the officer admitted, hesitating. The crew remained loyal. "Then what precisely did he do?" He hesitated. The word hung there, thin, absurd, and fatal. In the Reich's final winter, hesitation had become treason. On the third day, Meier was allowed to speak in his defense. The transcript later labeled it statement of conscience. He stood, hands steady on the table. "When I joined the Navy," he began, "I believed war could be honorable. I learned otherwise when the sea showed me what honor does to men who follow it without question. You call hesitation weakness. I call it the moment when humanity returns." One of the judges interrupted. "Humanity does not win wars. Then perhaps it ends them," Meier said quietly. Another officer slammed his hand against the table. "You insult the men who died." Meier met his eyes. "They did not die because of hesitation. They died because no one hesitated soon enough. The room fell silent. Even the clerk stopped writing for a heartbeat. Outside, artillery thunder rolled faintly from the distance, the war approaching its authors. The deliberation lasted less than an hour. The tribunal needed order, not truth. They returned with a single sentence: guilty on all counts. Sentence: removal from command, confinement pending review, and transfer to disciplinary custody. It was, in practice, a slow execution by bureaucracy. He would vanish into the machinery that produced obedience until nothing remained to question it. When they asked for a final statement, he said only, "If conscience is disobedience, then I accept the verdict." You cannot court-martial the tide. In the following weeks, the regime itself began to crumble. The same judges who condemned him now drafted evacuation orders. Files were burned, sentences left unsigned. The prison that held him was evacuated ahead of advancing Allied troops. Records stopped mid-paragraph. An interrogator later wrote in a private note, "We judged him to protect the idea of control. Now control itself has deserted us." Perhaps the man was right. No one ever found the final paper confirming Meier's punishment. Some said he escaped during the chaos. Others claimed he was transported inland and lost among thousands of displaced officers. The truth disappeared with the Reich itself. After the war, fragments of his statements circulated among surviving sailors. A few lines were copied into notebooks, carved onto memorials. Quoted without context. Obedience without thought is the first drowning. No one knew who first repeated it. But the phrase passed through generations of naval academies as an anonymous warning. Students assumed it belonged to some philosopher. Only a handful of old men remembered the captain who had said it at his court-martial, a man who once commanded a submarine and surrendered something greater than his ship. The war ended not with a roar, but with a long, exhausted silence. The oceans that had once carried fleets now carried wrecks, drifting like the bones of an empire. Along every coast lay reminders, rusted hulls, torn flags, names half-erased by salt. The sea, indifferent as ever, began the slow work of forgetting. No one knew what became of Captain Johann Meier. Some said he vanished with the last transport heading north. Others believed he was among the thousands captured, his name lost in the paper avalanche of surrender. The truth dissolved like ink in water. But stories have their own tides, and his continued to return, years after the war. A handful of U-boat veterans gathered each spring in Hamburg's harbor cafe. They were old men now, grey uniforms replaced by work jackets and silence. Among them was Meier's former first officer. He never spoke of his captain in detail, only that he was the last man I knew who listened to the ocean before he listened to Berlin. Sometimes they would walk the docks at sunset, staring out at ships that belonged to a new Germany, merchant vessels carrying food instead of war. One evening, a reporter approached them, asking about the old days. The first officer replied, "We learned too late that the enemy isn't always on the map." Then he turned away, unwilling to explain. In 1952, British archivists reviewing captured naval files found a folder labeled Disciplinary Proceedings, Confidential. Inside were fragments of a transcript, torn pages from Meier's court. Most lines were smudged, but one sentence remained clear. "The ocean forgives nothing, yet it teaches mercy." The archivist copied it into a report footnote, noting simply, "Author unidentified." That footnote later caught the eye of a historian who traced it back through survivor accounts. The legend of the submarine captain who surrendered his conscience began to take shape. Half history, half myth, 2 decades later. A fisherman off the coast of Brittany hauled up a rusted nameplate tangled in his nets. The letters were barely visible. U134. He kept it, cleaned it, and hung it on the wall of a small maritime museum. Visitors rarely noticed it among the larger exhibits, but sometimes someone would pause, reading the faded engraving beside it. In memory of those who chose conscience over command, no one had written it officially. It simply appeared one morning, signed only with the initials J.M. By the 1960s, Meier's story had entered naval folklore. Cadets at Kiel Naval Academy studied his trial not as a crime, but as a case in ethics. One instructor ended his lectures with a single line from the transcript: "Hesitation is humanity returning." The students would sit in silence, unsure whether to feel admiration or sorrow. The name Meier had become a symbol of the moment when obedience meets its limit. When a soldier remembers, he is first a man, on stormy nights. Fishermen in the North Atlantic still report strange echoes on sonar, rhythmic pulses that fade before they can be traced. Some say it's interference. Others, the ghosts of steel long buried. But the old sailors in Hamburg would smile and say, quietly, "The captain still patrols, whether myth or memory." The story endures because it speaks to something deeper than war. The battle between silence and conscience that every age must fight anew. The ocean, as Meier once wrote, keeps its own records. Not in ink, but in the sound of waves striking against forgotten hulls. In the soft roar beneath the wind that seems to say, "Remember." He vanished without a grave, leaving behind no victories, no monuments, only words. Yet sometimes words outlive empires. The ocean has forgotten the names of those who obeyed, but it still whispers the name of the man who hesitated. The camera would pull slowly away, a black and white image of a calm Atlantic horizon. Grey light reflecting on water, the distant cry of gulls fading into quiet. Then nothing but the sound of the tide.